Quite often, we end up in a situation where more than one rule can target a given element, and these rules can have conflicting styles. So let me show you how the browser figures out what rules should be applied. So let's define an article, and inside this article, let's define an h1 with the class of highlight. Okay, so here we say heading. Now, back to our style sheet, let's write a couple of different rules. We can write a rule for h1 elements and set their color to Dodger blue. Also, we can write a rule for elements with the class of highlight and set their color to deep pink. So now, both these rules target this h1 element. But which rule do you think is going to be applied? This is where selector specificity comes to play. Each selector has what we call a specificity or a weight. If multiple rules target the same element, the browser will apply the rule that is more specific. Now look at this triangle. This is what I call the specificity triangle. At the top of this triangle, we have the ID selector, because as you know, we cannot have two elements with the same ID. So the ID selector is very specific. It can only target a single element. Below the ID selector, we have class and attribute selectors. These selectors are less specific because we can have multiple elements with the same class or attributes. At the next level, we have the element selector because we can have many elements of a given type. So back to our style sheet, which selector do you think is more specific? The second selector, because we can have many h1 elements, but not all these h1 elements may have the class of highlight. So a class selector is more specific. And here in the browser, you can see our heading is pink. Now let me show you something. Let's right-click on the heading and go to Inspect. Here on the right side, you can see the class selector applied to this element that sets the color to pink. Below this selector, we have the element selector that sets the color to blue. But this property declaration is crossed out because it's been overwritten with the other property declaration over here. Now further down, we have another element selector that comes from normalize.css. So this style sheet applies a couple of styles to h1 elements. Further down, we have another element selector that comes from user agent style sheet. These are the default styles that Chrome applies to various elements. So every browser defines a set of styles for various HTML elements. That is why sometimes these styles are different, and we use normalize.css to normalize these styles. So we start from a common ground. Now back to our style sheet. Let's look at a few more examples. Another way to target this element is using an ID selector. So here in our markup, let's give this element an ID of products. Now, back to our style sheet. Here we can define a rule for an element with the ID of products. And then we can set the color to green. This selector is the most specific selector, so now our heading is green. Now, what if we have two selectors with equal specificity or equal weight? So let's duplicate this rule and change the color to, let's say, brown. Which rule do you think will be applied? The rule that comes last. So if I save the changes here and go back to browser, look, our heading is brown. All right, now let's get rid of this rule. We don't need it anymore. Let me show you something really cool in VS Code. If we hover our mouse over a selector, we can see its weight or specificity. So here in parentheses, we have three numbers. The first number on the left represents the number of ID selectors. In this case, we have 0 because we don't have an ID selector. The number in the middle represents the number of class or attribute selectors. Again, we have 0 because we don't have a class or attribute selector. And finally, the number on the right represents the number of element selectors. Here we have one element selector. That is why we have 1 here. So overall, the specificity of this element is 1. Now compare this with the specificity of this other selector. Here we have 0, 1, 0 because we have one class selector and the total specificity is 10. So 10 is greater than 1, and that is why this selector, or this rule more accurately, takes precedence. So our heading is currently green, but what if we want it to be blue? How can we prevent this rule from overwriting this style? Well, we have two solutions here. One solution is to use the important keyword. So as part of this declaration, we type an exclamation mark followed by the important keyword. When we apply this keyword, other rules will be discarded. Let me show you. So save the changes and back in the browser. Our heading is blue. Now let's inspect it. So even though we have more specific rules, these rules are ignored because we have used the important keyword. Now, while this looks like an easy solution, you should avoid it as much as possible. Using the important keyword is considered a bad practice because it can make your CSS messy and hard to maintain. You will end up wasting a lot of time troubleshooting and fixing styling issues. So let's get rid of this and talk about a better solution. The reason our heading is green is because of the third rule we have applied here. Now, what is the specificity of this rule? It is 100. So to make the heading blue, we have to write a rule that is more specific. So look at these three numbers here. The left number represents the number of ID selectors, the middle number represents the class or attribute selectors, and the right number represents the element selectors. So the rule that we want to write should have at least one ID selector and additionally a class or an element selector. So here we can select an element with the class of highlight and the ID of products. So here we have one class selector and one ID selector. Let's look at the specificity. That is 110. So now, if we set the color to Dodger blue, our heading turns blue. Beautiful. Now, instead of a class selector, we can use an element selector. So we can target an H1 with the ID of products. This selector is more specific than the previous one. Let's look at the specificity. That is 101 compared to 100. So once again, we get a blue heading. Let me show you another way. Let's give this article element an ID or a class of featured. Now, back to our style sheet. We can select an element with the class of featured, and in this element, we can target an element with the ID of products. What do you think is the specificity of this rule? It should be 110 because we have one class selector and one ID selector. Take a look. 110. So we can get rid of the important keyword by writing a more specific selector. But don't go overboard with this approach. For example, I don't want you to write a selector like HTML, body, featured, H2, products, highlight. This selector is way too specific. It's really hard to read and understand this. And if in the future we run into styling issues, we'll have to write even a more specific selector. So our CSS will become really messy and hard to maintain.